Is the law on your side? Herb Gray is a parent, and he volunteers at his son's school. As an attorney, he knows the law, the Constitution, and parents' rights.
If you paid attention closely to the language in some of Lori's slides, you noticed over and over and over again, community-based resources. How many times did you see the word parent or family in any of those slides? And I will tell you that the regulations that Lori was referring to actually go on for something like 80 pages. What you're seeing is just kind of a taste of what this is all about. But the idea here is that there are tools available, and most people don't really have a good sense of what the law really is. And basically, it starts with the United States Constitution, and specifically the 14th Amendment Due Process Clause, which is the basis for parental rights and has been for centuries in this country. That is also reflected in the United States Code and the federal regulations. Now, what you need to understand is Oregon Department of Education has their name all over it. Oregon Health Authority has their name all over it. But guess where the money comes from? Washington, D.C., Title 10. How many of you have heard of the Department of Health and Human Services? Okay. They're the ones that administer that money and give it away liberally. Can you think of anything else that they have been involved in recent times that maybe hasn't gone so well? The Unaffordable Care Act, correct? So we're talking health care for everybody. We're talking about health for students. So I know you all probably read opinions of the United States Supreme Court. Only in my line of work do you talk about submitting something that's 100 some odd pages and call it a brief. So I want to just give you a flavor of where parental rights really come from, and it starts with the decisions of the United States Supreme Court. Now, way back in 1925, it seems that there were some Catholic parents who wanted to send their kids to private schools in a little wayward, backward place called Oregon. And the state of Oregon said, wait a minute, you can't be doing that. And the United States Supreme Court said, the child is not the mere creature of the state. And they talk further about the liberty of parents and guardians to direct the upbringing of their children under their control. This case from this little backward state called Oregon is the lead case in all the jurisprudence on parental rights. Now, for those that maybe weren't paying attention in 1925, the Supreme Court got to explain it to everybody again in 1944, this time in a case from Massachusetts. And again, you see that the Supreme Court saying, it's cardinal with us that the custody, care, and nurture of children resides first in the parents, who is primarily responsible for kids. And part of that responsibility or that freedom that parents have is to prepare kids for obligations in our society that the state can neither supply nor hinder. Can the government teach your kids all the things that they really need to know to be good citizens? No. Probably not. Now, the thing is that if we think about those obligations, what are those kinds of obligations? Well, since people apparently weren't paying attention in 1925 or in 1944, we took another swing at it with the Amish in Wisconsin in 1972. And again, the Amish had the audacity to think that they ought to be able to educate their kids themselves instead of sending them to public school. And for the third time in less than 50 years, the Supreme Court talked about what the rights of parents are and what these obligations that parents are supposed to teach their kids are. Now pay attention to these words. Additional obligations includes the inculcation of moral standards, religious beliefs, and elements of good citizenship. Now, in 1977, in a little different context, again, the Supreme Court talked about the sanctity of the family. And they said that it's in the family that we inculcate and pass down many of our most cherished values, moral and cultural. And then, for the really remedial students that kind of need a 2x4 alongside the head, in the year 2000, the United States Supreme Court quoted from that case from Oregon in 1925 and said that we've rejected any notion the child is a mere creature of the state, quoting directly out of that decision 75 years before, and that parents have the right, coupled with the high duty, to recognize and prepare their children for additional obligations. So you see what goes with this is freedom and obligation. And all of that rests with the parents. Over 75 years, the Supreme Court has stayed with the same line. Now, this also is reflected in federal statutes. And I've just pulled out a couple of them here. The FERPA Act protects the privacy of family records and information. Now, why is that important? Well, part of the components of a lot of the things that Lori shared with you is having kids do surveys. And you got to see some of those surveys. So what goes on at home? Ever see any domestic violence at home? Are there guns in the house? They're supposed to tell you in advance that they're going to do that. That doesn't always happen. How many of you want the school collecting information on your family without your knowledge? And again, the Protection of Pupil Rights Act says any instructional material used in the classroom, parents get to see. Now, what happens if you go to the average teacher or perhaps the principal of a school and say, I'd like to see the materials you're using in health class? Well, it goes something like this. Well, we have a summary of it. No, I asked for the materials. Well, we've only got one copy and the teacher needs it. I'd like to see it. Well, we really can't take that away from the teacher. I'd like to see it. Well, you're the only one complaining. I'd like to see it. Now, the only thing you have backing you up is federal law, and I'll show you in a minute, state law. All the teacher or the principal has backing them up is obstinance. Now, let's talk a little bit about what Oregon law says on these subjects. The first statute that you see up there is one of my favorites, because this talks about all the stuff that's supposed to get top priority in classrooms. Honesty, morality, courtesy, obedience to law, respect for the national flag, the Constitution of the United States. Oh, wait a minute. Respect for parents in the home. I dare say if you went up to the average school teacher or the average administrator, the average school board member and say, so how do you teach respect for parents in the home in your school district? Say, well, it's in the education code. The second statute there is really an important one for you to have in your hip pocket, because just like the federal statute, the Protection of Pupil Rights Act, this says parents have the right to be notified in advance that a course is going to be taught. Not after it happens, not the first day that they're teaching it, in advance. And since we're all intelligent people, we can read on and see that any parent or guardian may inspect the instructional material to be used before or during the time the course is taught. And then if you look at all this stuff and you decide you don't want your kid exposed to it, you can ask to have your kid excused. Now, is any of that ambiguous? You get to see it beforehand, you get to see it during, and if you don't like it, you get to say your kid's not participating. So, armed with all this law, we don't have any problems, do we? Well, let me just say, and I don't think this is much of a secret, especially after you heard from Lori, we may be leaking oil a little bit on some of these things. And there's a couple of trends I think you need to understand are going on. One is, back in the day, we all kind of, whether we went to church or not, we all pretty much believed in Judeo-Christian values, and those were pretty well recognized, and they were seen as fixed standards. Well, we've gotten better over time. Now it doesn't matter what you believe, because all points of view are entitled to equal deference and respect. So the idea that there is truth or any sort of timeless standard is kind of taking a beating nowadays. The 14th Amendment that I talked about and all those Supreme Court cases I showed you, part of the reason I went through all those in excruciating detail is so that you can see what has happened is that the Congress and also the Oregon State Legislature has said, well, we need to kind of pass laws that say it's okay for parents to be involved in this process. Now, for all of you who've had civics or a government class, what's the highest source of authority that can be enacted by a government? A constitution. What's next? A statute. Why are we passing statutes to say the same thing that the Constitution already says? And finally, all of those cases and all of those statutes I just showed you, which are supported by regulations and so on, basically shore up the idea of parents having the primary control, right? That doesn't work so well if the government has a different idea about how kids ought to be raised and taught. So because of that, what we have is an increasing emphasis on what I call government mandates. So the idea is, even though we have law on the books, the government itself is saying that doesn't matter and we know better. So it's not what we're talking about here again. It's not the average school teacher that's the boogeyman. It's not the average principal. What it is a whole bunch of government officials way up the food chain who have helpful friends whispering in their ear to say, now it's time for us to take control of the kids. Armed with all of this, you may be saying, what in the heck can I do? First of all, if you happen to have a few of these statutes in your hip pocket, you can have a very interesting conversation with somebody that doesn't want to share this information with you when you ask. The idea is that you could actually go up to a principal or a teacher who's resisting you and say, you know, you really wouldn't want to deny me the chance to look at that stuff when federal and state law allows me to do it. Would you? Now, if you believe in the rule of law and you put law in front of them, what do you suppose they're going to do?
Nothing.
They either have to tell you to your face the law doesn't matter, or they have to do what you ask. Now, one of the things that there's all kinds of nuggets buried in the education code, and one of them talks about encouragement of family communication and involvement. If they don't want to share information with you, you can always say, right down here in the education code, it says that the schools are supposed to insist on encouragement of family communication and involvement to help students learn to make responsible decisions and for abstinence to be emphasized. So again, your question to the school official would be, so if the state law requires that, why would you be telling me I can't? And what's really important too is that it's not just parents who have some rights here. If the teachers don't want to be involved in teaching this stuff, all they have to do is say, I'm not going to do it. In the face of all of this, what you need to understand is the conversation we're having tonight is taking place in more and more communities in this state. The thing is that you have a lot more to work with than you may think. You may say, well, who am I? But sometimes asking the right question in polite company out in front of everybody else can really accomplish some great things.
For more information, contact parentsrightsined.net.